warships are vulnerable. There's this perpetual game of cat and mouse, tactics versus counter-tactics.
I'm David Knowles, and this is a bonus episode of Battle Lines.
I made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
Over the past few years, Ukraine has stunned the world in the Black Sea, pushing back the Russian fleet and sinking numerous vessels. The war at sea is not the major theatre in the Russo-Ukrainian war, but affords a number of lessons for navies around the world. But what are those lessons? Is it really true that drones have fundamentally changed war at sea, and how should we all respond? What is the current British thinking, and what is happening in China, where the production of new military vessels is dwarfing the efforts of Western countries? I spoke to former Royal Navy officer Tom Sharp, asking him for his reading of the Battle of the Black Sea, what we should learn from the failure of the Russian Navy, and what we should know about China's frenetic shipbuilding program. Here's our conversation. Well, Tom, thank you so much for your time, and it's good to see you back in the Telegraph offices. Could we start this discussion just by recapping what we've seen broadly in the Black Sea over the past 2.5 years since the start of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine?
Of course, at the start of the war, the Black Sea was a heavily contested maritime environment. We had the Black Sea Fleet there, and they were dictating the pace. They were calling the shots when it came to trade from Ukraine, and they were effectively interdicting that through a number of different ways, but doing so effectively. Grain and many other things actually were no longer being exported out of Ukraine, which was affecting their economy, and I think really often overlooked the economy and the well-being of many of the countries that grain is heading to, particularly in Africa. So it was a sort of slightly more classic maritime environment. You had Russian cruisers like the Moskva patrolling, and let's not forget it was them off Snake Island that almost started this whole thing with that classic interaction that's become a meme. So that was at the start. Now gradually what happened over time is that Ukrainians started to make better and better use of uncrewed surface vessels, drones, call them what you will, and they targeting with those drones started to become increasingly effective. And over time, what we saw was ships getting beaten back, but also their infrastructure, the ports, Sevastopol being probably the first one, were all slowly coming within range of this rapidly expanding area of operations that the Ukrainians were building their drones into, whether it was the Majura V5 drone or whether it was the Striker came along a little bit later. These are relatively new bits of kit for Ukraine. But it wasn't just them on their own. They were running those operations in concert with some fairly sophisticated air suppression attacks by special forces and so on and so forth. So it wasn't just drones on their own, but they very clearly were leading the way and causing extreme discomfort. Sevastopol was absolutely whacked. The retreating headquarters got hit 2 days later, killing a bunch of people. So that was the first sign that the tide, so to speak, at sea had changed slightly.
So, Tom, where are we now when we look at the Black Sea empty of Russian ships?
Yeah, they do still have some ships and submarines. And it is worth, I think, probably mentioning that so long as they have anything that can fire the Caliber cruise missile, they're not defeated. They've been described as defeated by various politicians inevitably trying to score some kind of points. That's slightly ahead of ourselves. They are, I think, probably functionally defeated. I think their ability to operate effectively at sea at the moment has been reduced to the point of almost zero. So they were driven out of Sevastopol and they went further and further east. Now they've been driven out of the Sea of Azov. 1/3 of their entire Black Sea fleet is now at the bottom. Again, that started with the Moskva, and I think that set the scene in some respects for these were not invincible. These were not 10 feet tall, the titans of the Soviet Union. These were, a quick study of the Moskva sinking shows a real vulnerability, a real lack of maritime preparedness. And we'll come on to that when we talk about defending against drones more generally. But now they're in the Far East. Now, Caliber has the legs to go across the entire Black Sea. So like I say, as long as they've got Caliber shooters, they're not completely out of this. But the lack of air picture they have, the lack of surveillance, lack of intelligence, and the fact they've been driven so far east, I think means that functionally they're out of it for now.
Well, that's a great way to bring us up to date. I think the Part of the reason we want to have this discussion is because the failure of the Russian Black Sea Fleet has led to a fairly basic, maybe a bit simplistic question to be posed. We've seen across different newspapers and programs that whether the Ukrainians' ability to employ seaborne drones to sink ships and sink, as you said, a third of a fleet means that conventional navies have become worthless. Their time is up. You pose the question, do we even need a navy anymore? And that's, I think, the simplest way to get into it. I know what your views are, but could you start just by running through the arguments for the proposition? Why do people think this, and why might they have a point?
If you look at the fundamentals of uncrewed warfare, there's a lethality versus cost benefit. You get a lot of bang for your buck, and you don't have to put people in harm's way to operate it. So at a very fundamental political decision-making level, if you propose to a minister who has to make a snap decision who may not know anything about it, they may know a lot, they may know nothing, but you say, look, there's this alternative with 200 people, or there's this alternative with no people, and this costs half the amount. At that very basic level, you can see why there's a temptation to go, okay, well, uncrewed is the answer.
Well, let's get into the arguments against. You make, I think, quite a convincing case that conventional navies have not had their day. It'd be quite kind of surprising looking back over 3,000, 4,000 years of world history if this was suddenly the moment. Can you take us through, I guess there's two things here. There's the more abstract sense in which this is not true, but there's also the very specific scenario in the Black Sea that we've seen developing, which you argue is curious and peculiar to the Black Sea.
On the more general point, the navies spend most of their time not fighting. I think this is where airmen and soldiers sometimes blur the lines, because they get generally, not airmen perhaps not, but soldiers get spun up when there's someone to go and have a scuffle with. The whole point of navies throughout history has been to stop that scuffle happening in the first place and be ready to get stuck in if that fails. So 90%, in fact, probably 98% of your time in the Navy is not fighting. And therefore, if you take people out of that, you've completely taken away all those tasks. The influence tasks, the communications tasks, the shaping, the gathering of information, the soft power in different countries. You take people out of the equation and all of those are done. So again, if you zoom in on the fighty bit, the very final part of the curve that's like the sort of top 2% that you hope to never get to, drones start making more sense. But at the very soft end, they make no sense at all.
Talk to us about the Black Sea then, and why what we've seen happen there to Russia's fleet potentially has more to do with the environment and the specific factors at play during this conflict.
Yeah, the Black Sea has some peculiarities on top of the sort of general maritime use of drones. Let's not lose sight of the fact that there are many, many lessons to be learned from Ukrainians' use of drones in the Black Sea. But one of them isn't the demise of surface warships. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, the Black Sea is quite small. It wouldn't be if you tried to swim across it, but in maritime warfare terms, it's fairly small. And their bases, the Russian bases that have been struck so successfully, are within range of those drone bases, and there's nothing they can do about it. Generally speaking, range is your friend at sea, and you just withdraw to the safe point. But they can't do that. They're stuck there. So that's the first point. The second one is it's a reasonably calm sea. I mean, this is up for debate, but compared to, say, the North Atlantic or the Southern Ocean, it's on average it's a lower sea state. So that puts you the advantage on the attacker, because again, if it's rough, most warships can outrun most drones. And by rough, I mean a sea state 3 or above, 1.5, 1.25 meters. Anything above that, you can outrun a drone. So again, a peculiar advantage to the Black Sea, to Ukraine on that one. I've already mentioned it, but they've got almost no air picture. The Russian has no real surveillance and no ability to spot these drones coming early. In any kind of a recognized air picture, any kind of NATO environment would have a recognized air picture over the whole of the Black Sea that spots this stuff happening sometimes before it's even launched. The Russians don't have that. So every time that they launch, it's a surprise. Back to the Moskva, again, the Russians don't have layered defense in around their ships. There's no close-in, medium, and far-range layers. This is connected to the surveillance piece, but they don't have it. And the Moskva got hit by 2 cruise missiles, subsonic cruise missiles. That should never happen to a cruiser. There should be someone in the way. And again, with the drones, and they're not learning that lesson. One of the reasons they're not learning that lesson is because of the Montreux Convention, which means they can't reinforce. So they can't get new ships and equipment through the Bosphorus because the Montreux Convention prevents it. Again, in any other conflict, if you were taking a hammering in that regard, you'd bolster that, and they can't do it. And then my final point is that they just haven't prepared to take drone attacks in the way that NATO navies have. And we've got our friends in Iran to thank for this. They've been throwing fast attack crafts and fast inshore attack craft and low, slow flyers, sometimes manned, sometimes not manned, for decades now. So every NATO navy that's ever been anywhere near the Straits of Hormuz and further north has practiced this kind of defense again and again. And I took my frigate up into the Northern Gulf a few times. And before going, we thrashed this. And we had quick draw teams, which meant the entire upper deck was weaponized. We maneuvered at 30 knots. We had a helicopter airborne, et cetera, et cetera. When you watch the videos of the Russian ships getting struck by these drones, they're not really doing very much. They've got people holding rifles, which is no use at sea at all. So again, there's all these things add up to make the operating environment in the Black Sea, reference the Black Sea Fleet, peculiar and therefore dangerous, to rip lessons from that and apply it internationally.
Just to spell it out then for our listeners, when those 2 Neptune missiles were fired at the Moskva, which in history sent it to the bottom of the Black Sea, what should have happened and what did we see?
Really, about 100 things should have happened before they were even launched. The launchers could have been detected by proper satellite surveillance. Again, if you've got these rings in place, you're going to spot the launcher before it even launches. You're probably going to spot the telltale comms communications chatter and maybe even the missile head spinning up on the launcher before they fire. So there's all these things before it's even been shot, that's when you want to hit it, right? Shoot the archer, not the arrow. But the minute these things are airborne, again, if you've got any kind of a radar picture, you're going to spot these 2 things coming at you. It doesn't matter that they're sea skimming because you've got airborne coverage. Again, not there, not present, or if it was present, not paying attention. Then the thing turns a seeker head on. The Neptune is an active missile, so it turns a seeker head on at a certain range, and that fires an unmistakable electronic warfare signal at your ship, which would light up your ops room. And the electronic warfare officer blows a whistle, just in case anyone's missed it, to say active seekhead bearing 230, strength 2, low, fast. And then you get all your weapons onto it. If you haven't already done it, you maneuver the ship onto what's called an anti-ship missile defense course, where you can do soft kill on these missiles. So you can jam them, you can put up chaff, you can distract them off the ship. Doesn't get as much coverage as hitting them with missiles. It's not as sexy, but actually is quite often more effective. And if that fails, then you fire missiles, and that can shoot them. Or better still, you have a destroyer up threat, maneuvering hard, and they're taking one for the team. And all of this was absent. And in fact, when you look at the Moskva before she sunk, her fire control radars were pretty much stowed forward and aft. There was no indication that they even saw these things coming. So again, to the generic point about how many lessons do we learn, you've got to be careful about arrogance here, but we don't need to learn any of those lessons from that particular incident because they were just real basics that were missing.
That's fascinating. So it's a sort of peculiar combination of environmental and geographic factors of the Black Sea itself and the slightly surprising lack of preparedness and ability to deal with the threat that the Russians displayed over the past 2 years. Is that
exactly right? Sort of peculiarities with a healthy dash of incompetence over the top.
As you said, of course, navies are watching what's going on. Can you give us a sense of what potentially the Royal Navy is thinking of what's happening and what lessons they may have taken from the success of the Ukrainian drones?
Yeah, so the use of drones is the direction of travel, by which I mean it's unavoidable, partly for the reasons I outlined earlier, lethality and cost, but partly because they're just so useful. So it is the direction of travel. What has to be tempered is the pace of that direction. And when budgets are squeezed or someone who is a forward thinker comes along, they can drive that process too far. So the Navy has an entire division, an entire department looking at the drone situation, both offensively and defensively. And there are definitely 2 parts to this. We, I think, probably as a country and as a NATO Navy, we tend to default to the defensive. I think we're generally ahead of the game when it comes to defending attacks. For example, the FACFIAC, the fast attack craft threat from Iran, were perhaps a little bit slower. How do we do this? How do we turn the tables? How do we do this ourselves and go on the offensive? But these are being looked at. We've got an entire Navy division being headed up by a Rear Admiral doing this day in, day out as their day job. Resources, of course, are the key. That now needs to be resourced. We need to information share with other countries. The US, needless to say, are looking at this, hugely looking at this, and resourcing it slightly better as well. So they're slightly further down the track.
You say their resources are the key. Can we zoom out of Europe, zoom out of the Black Sea, out of Europe, and look at a place where resources seem, from what the satellite images tell us, almost limitless, and look at the huge expansion of China's navy? And I'd be interested if you could just tell us what we think is happening. What are they building? And my understanding is that they're building something really that we haven't seen before in navies around the world. Can you tell us about this?
Yes, the Chinese are playing what we would call fantasy fleets. So we have these conversations on Twitter about what we would have if we could afford it, and then very quickly you come back to, okay, all right, forget that. What do we need? What can we do? They aren't doing that. They are building the equivalent of the Royal Navy every 2 years. They're the Fujian aircraft carrier, which is 2/3 the size of the Gerald R. Ford and looks identical, by the way. One might think they perhaps copied some of it, is going to be ready in a couple of years. And now they're building this amphibious flat top, a big deck amphibious vessel similar to the USS Wasp and that class of ship, but bigger. And they've put an electromagnetic catapult on it. Now which is a first.
What is that?
So it's what you would use in your aircraft carriers for launching fast jets. It's previously there were steam catapults, so the US carriers, nuclear carriers have steam catapults. The Nimitz class generate steam, and they literally catapult the jet off the front of the ship at high speed, and then there's an arrestor wire to catch it. Very expensive, but tried and tested, and there's various reasons why the UK didn't go down that road, but China have. China's have built their new aircraft carrier with 3 of these catapults. Actually, the USS Ford, the biggest one, has 4. Doesn't matter. The point is they've got these very expensive, very technical, very difficult to build electromagnetic catapults, and they're working on their aircraft carrier. And okay, fine, catapults on aircraft carriers is normal. You want these things way out to sea. Going back to range and how that's your friend. You want them hundreds of miles out to sea. So the faster you can launch this jet off the deck, the more payload it can carry and the longer endurance it has. So the faster you do that, the better. So that makes perfect sense for an aircraft carrier. What they've now done is fitted it to an amphibious big deck landing ship. So these tend to be cheaper, about half the size, maybe slightly less. They tend to operate slightly further in because they're assault ships. So they'll have vertical launch jets. If the American ones have vertical launch jets, quite often they'll have a well deck at the back out of which swimmer vehicles and hovercraft and landing craft can all be deployed. So these are slightly they're not the exquisite eye-catching ships of the aircraft carriers. They're the ones below that. And therefore, they're a bit cheaper. They're normally a bit rough and ready. You wouldn't put an electromagnetic catapult on it. But China has, almost because they can. They've just gone, do you know what? This is working. Let's put it on there. They may not even know what they want to fly from it yet. Again, the deck isn't big enough to fly big, crude aircraft, but it is big enough to fly bigger drones, bigger uncrewed systems. So what they've done is built a huge amount of flexibility for the length of that ship's life, probably 50 years, right from the offset. Because they can, they've built in this tremendous flexibility and capability.
So just to try and understand this, make sure I've understood it in layman's terms, this is a sort of amphibious assault ship, so it's going to come right up to a coast where they can land. Out of the back will come hovercraft and landing vehicles. It'll be able to fire big reconnaissance drones, attack drones, FPV drones off the front, maybe helicopters if they've got space. And China are building a whole lot of them, and they'll be ready in a couple of years. Yeah,
so they've already got some smaller, less capable without the electromagnetic catapult. The one that's caught the eye is the new one, and I mean that the dock in which that was being built was completed in September 2023. This thing looks like it's halfway through being built. In other words, it looks from the images I've seen as if it's going to go from an idea to completion and sea trials in about 2 years, which is, I think our ships take about 10 to 12 years for the equivalent thing. And incidentally, in the dock, sitting with this Franken monster amphibious landing craft are 3 more destroyers that they just happen to be building as well as an afterthought. It's also a commercial dock, and it's a commercial company that are building these warships. So they've got this tremendous crossover going on. It's a total maritime vision that leaves us in the US way behind. Embarrassingly behind, and I'm not seeing any signs of it being corrected.
Something that's remarked upon sometimes when we talk about the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, is that sure they have hundreds of thousands of troops, lots of equipment, but we really have no idea how effective they might be because China has not engaged in a full-scale war for a very, very long time. Does that same question or critique apply to the Chinese Navy as well?
Yeah, it really does. It's a very good point. And we just don't know. I mean, there will be people there or thereabouts who can make estimates. For example, their destroyers a few years ago had captains on board with 8 years sea experience. They're building them so fast. So if your captain has 8 years, which isn't enough, that's not enough. It sounds slightly pompous, but you need to accrue this time. But it's not just necessarily the captain. If the captain's got 8 years, then what have the heads of department got, and so on. So you can end up with a very inexperienced crew just in maritime terms. In combat terms, as you say, there's really no way of knowing. But it's really important you do know, because when we wargame these scenarios, let's say the Taiwan Strait, or let's say Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, whichever scenario it is, the US wargame these things to a high degree of fidelity. They have wargaming computers and they enter all the data. That missile has this range, this degree of effectiveness, this likelihood of lethality, this percentage likelihood of that missile not working. And you plug in all this data and then you set them away and you see what comes out of it. But if you get that assessment of their capability wrong in the first instance, like I think we probably over-egged how capable Iranian missiles were. We've always assumed that there's thousands of these things and they're pretty good. But if you look at certainly what the Houthis have been using and the ones that were shot down heading to Israel, they were pretty bad. So like I say, if you don't get that initial assessment wrong of combat capability and then general experience, then your entire war game algorithm is wrong, and therefore your planning assumptions will also be wrong. So it's really important, but very hard to know.
Can I ask one more question to round this all up, moving away from China? A line that comes back to me in the very famous Russell Crowe film, Master and Commander: Far Side of the World, is when they're talking about Navy tactics and strategy at sea. And one of his crew says, Nelson, some would say not a great sailor. In battle, he said, you just have to go straight at him. And that's sort of what we see at Trafalgar, right? The ships adopt a sort of kind of crazy thing of just going quite slowly, straight, and nobody expects that. To what extent, as a Navy captain, to what extent do you think that's true? And do you think that is a useful way to think of fighting at sea?
Yeah, you have to be innovative. If you're doctrinal, you'll fail. The enemy can predict what you're doing. I mean, this is the Moskva sat on a patrol line for weeks on end, going up and down it. So it was the easiest thing to target in the world. You have to be innovative. I was on board HMS Diamond this morning talking to the captain just back off that extraordinary patrol in the Red Sea. And they never sat still. I mean, they couldn't because there were missiles in the air every day. And they shot down more missiles than any UK ship ever. Missiles and drones. So you can't just turn up having read the doctrine book and do that. You have to innovate. You have to adapt. You have to keep your team motivated. The Navy is really good at going to sea to do one thing and finding before you're anywhere near it that it's completely changed and you've been told to do something else. That is core maritime business. Now, there is an argument developing that perhaps the Navy's too good at it. Our ability our can-do attitude, which is our great strength in warfighting, perhaps is a little bit of our undoing when it comes to resources and presentation, because you hear the Secretaries of State saying it all the time. We are always achieving our tasking. Well, there's a reason for that. And it comes at a cost in terms of equipment and people. So this is a double-edged sword. We train into our people, exactly as you described it, the ability to innovate. I mean, the Nelsonian crossing of the T, actually, it wasn't his original idea, but it was Nelson, so he kind of nicked the PR and used it to great effect. But that kind of thing, if you're working against a British submarine and they're the enemy submarine, and you're predictable for 1 second, they'll get you. When I was operating against Russian submarines in the high north in my frigate, they were predictable. They're well run, incidentally. They're nothing like I described the Black Sea Fleet. They are well run, but they're quite doctrinal. They're quite predictable. So yeah, innovation is one of the maritime principles of war, no doubt.
Tom, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important for our listeners to hear?
Yeah, I just think we need to look. Warships are vulnerable. They have been since the days of ramming-shaped bows, cannon, missiles, torpedoes, and so there's this perpetual game of cat and mouse, tactics versus counter-tactics. Only on a few occasions has something come along that's completely changed the character of warfare, completely changed it. Drones isn't one of those. It's changing the nature of it. It's changing the shape of it. And it will do so for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And maybe one day we'll have autonomous ships, drones, submarines, people, everyone ashore. Maybe one day. But the key is getting that progression at the right speed, given in the very resource-constrained environment we find ourselves in. But crewed ships are going to be part of this equation for many, many years.
Tom Sharp, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Dagahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.